In this video, you will learn about an introduction to AAA. We'll also describe the different parts of AAA, and then we'll see how to turn on AAA. Remember that in the previous video, our lab setup changed a little, where we added the CCP workstation. Some of you may already be familiar with what AAA means. In fact, throughout this video series, we have seen the different parts of AAA in one form or the other. AAA actually stands for authentication, which is the first A. The second A is authorization. As the second A, authorization. While the final A is accounting. Now in some books you also see accounting or auditing. It basically means the same thing. So I will just put auditing in the bracket. So what is authentication? Authentication is verifying who a person is. So if I come into an organization and I show my ID card, then that is authentication. Authorization is what the person can do once the person is in the organization or is on the resource. So what a person can do. So basically authorization talks about level of access. And finally, accounting is what the person did. So accounting is more retrospective. What the person did. So it kind of looks back, it takes logs and things like that. Like I said, throughout this video series, we have seen different parts of this AAA in one form or the other. For example, when we configured all the usernames and password combinations, this was a level of authentication in one way or the other. One way that we have seen authorization is privilege levels. Or if you also remember the user profile that we configured on CCP, where we restricted the user from being able to use the configure button or the configure mode. Yeah, that's a level of authorization. We're saying what can the person do, and we said the person cannot perform configure actions. And finally, accounting. You may not have noticed, but we have also seen accounting in the logs. So when an interface came up, for example, and then it showed on the console that this particular interface just came up. Yeah, so that's an example of a log. Of course, it could be more than that, where we talk about what the user did while the person was connected to the router, for example. Maybe the person issued this particular command and then we can view the logs later. If the person was not supposed to issue some things and then he did, that's what accounting tells us. But what is the purpose of AAA to us? In the previous videos, we have seen how to use things like enable secrets, and we configured username on the data, that's on the local database of the routers. And then we have seen all these different parts of AAA. So why do we need AAA as a particular feature? Now you'll notice that in the previous videos, all we have been doing is configuring authentication or authorization for a particular device. So it was more about securing the management plane of the device, which deals with connections made to the device itself. But what of a network in general, like an organization's network? Organizations have different ways by which they authenticate users to their network, and one that you may be familiar with is the Windows Active Directory. So when you get onto your system, you log onto a particular domain. Now that's a form of authentication. In fact, in Windows, there are several authorization mechanisms, like if a particular user is in this domain, then he cannot connect to this printer or he cannot use this particular resource on the network. So those are different levels of authorization. So you need to understand that AAA is not a Cisco feature, it's more of a security implementation. But as we'll get to find out, Cisco has its own implementation of AAA. I mentioned earlier that the features that we've been configuring deal with the management plane. But when we want to talk about the data plane, for example, so if you already have users on your Windows Active Directory, do you have to create them all over again on your local database? That would be very, very cumbersome. Apart from that, if you have several devices, let's say you have 10 routers and you have 50 switches, are you going to configure username and password on all those devices? There has to be a different method, and that is what AAA allows us to do. So in essence, we can say AAA looks beyond the device itself. It looks at the entire network. So we're not talking about just management plane, we're also talking about the data plane, which deals with transit traffic. Also, when we get to authorization, some users should not be able to connect to some particular parts of the network. And AAA allows us to restrict these users based on their authorization profile. It could be as deep as NAC. It could be as simple as privilege levels. We are going to see some of these features as we go on in this video series. So let's just wrap up this part with an analogy. If we go to your bank, for example, and you want to collect money over the counter, you have the customer assistant who attends to you. Now in the morning, the person probably came into the office or came into the bank and logged into the network. the person authenticated to the network, probably using their user ID and maybe a password. Now, just because the person authenticated onto the network doesn't mean the person can do everything. Doesn't mean the person is allowed to do everything. So if, for example, the person is not allowed to alter your bank balance, and this is what authorization does. And at the end of the day, the person is supposed to give an account of all they have done. And that is what accounting is about. So we have seen the three parts of AAA. The first one being authentication, who the person is, and then authorization, what can the person do when the person is on the network, and then accounting is what the person did while the person was on the network or on the device. Now let's head over to the configuration terminal and see what we have. So I'm just going to do a show run on R1 and see what we currently have on R1. So we have our enable secret. Notice here that it says no AAA new model, and we'll talk about this command in a few minutes. Let's just go all the way down to the end. So we have different usernames that we configured, and then if we go to our line console, we can see we're still using the login locale. On our VTY lines, we're also using login locale. So it means if I exit out of the console right now and try to log in again, it should ask me for a username. So I'll use one of the ones we configured, Bob and Cisco 1. And then since we have an enable secret, we'll just enter it, Cisco. Now let's talk about that command, show run. I'll just include AAA. Now by default, AAA is turned off on Cisco devices. So the command to turn it on is actually AAA new model. But of course, you need to be very careful when you turn on AAA, because AAA changes the authentication and authorization features of the device entirely. Just take note of where we currently are, and then we're going to configure AAA. So AAA new model, this is the command to enable AAA. One thing that is advisable before you enable AAA is to have some username configured on your local database. Because if you configure AAA and you get locked out of your router somehow and you don't have usernames on the local database, if you are not on console, you may not be able to get in. Now I'll just show you why I said that AAA changes the authentication feature of the router. I'll exit out of console right now. Remember previously that before we were able to get back into console, right now we had to use Bob and we had to enable a password. So let me just exit and try to come in again. Notice that I'm placed in the user exec mode automatically. So AAA has overridden our login locale. The login locale on the console line is no more effective. But of course our enable secret is still there. So let me just enable and then Cisco. So as you can see, AAA has completely overridden everything that we have. Let's also go to R2 and telnet right now. So telnet to 1.1.1. So it asks me for a username, Bob Cisco. No, it should actually be Bob and Cisco 1. Bob Cisco 1. So you notice that AAA has overridden our configuration on R1. So let's check our config right now, show run, and then let's just look at the section line. So look at what happened. Login local has been removed completely from the console. It has also been removed from the VTY lines. This should tell you something, which I'll highlight right now. When you enable AAA, automatically it removes every authentication that you have configured on your console. That is on the console. Now on your VTY lines, it automatically enables a username and a password. That is why I said that if you configure AAA and you don't have username and password in your local database, if for example you configured it while you were remote, like through a remote connection, and you try to log in again, you will not be able to log in until you come to console. So AAA doesn't have authentication features on your console, but on your VTY lines, it automatically enables username and password combination, which is what we saw in R2. So we've seen how to configure AAA through the CLI, and that is what we did on R1. Let's use the CCP tool to configure it on R2. By now, you should be relatively familiar with this interface. So this is 1.1.1, which is R1, and then 2.2.2, which is R2. I have discovered these devices. So we're concerned with configuring 2.2.2. So if we just come to the community member here and select 2.2 and go to configure. Now under router, you will notice AAA. There's a folder called AAA. And under that folder, there are different subfolders. We'll look at all these other ones later, the AAA server and groups, the authentication policies, authorization policies, and accounting policies. For now, we'll just go to the AAA summary. If you look at the AAA summary, it tells you the value for all of these things. So the AA server groups, we have nothing there. We have no authentication policies, we have no authorization policies. And if you notice here, it says that AAA is disabled, and then we have a button to enable AAA. So let's just enable it. Once you click on that button, this dialog box shows up. This is because the wrong configuration of AAA can be very disastrous. So it tells you that it's going to configure authentication and authorization for VTY lines, and then the local database will be used for both authentication and authorization. It also tells you that it's going to configure authentication for the console line, and then the local database will also be used for authentication. So let me just enable AAA. Yes. Now once I close this dialog box, I'm going to show you why I'm getting this config. Because for me, I like seeing the configuration that is going to send to my device. So you notice that this is the AAA new model. Now it's going to configure some authorization and authentication policies, which we're going to talk about in the next video. And then it's going to apply them here. For now, you don't need to worry about this. Just know that it's enabling AAA using the AAA new model. And I'm going to deliver this configuration to the device. And then it tells me configuration delivered to device. I'm going to click on OK. And notice now that the AAA has changed to enable. Before we end this video, I want to show you how to preview commands that are sent to your device from the CCP. So you just come under Application, you come under Options. So notice that this Show CLI Preview is checked. That is how I can actually see the commands that are being sent to the device. If I uncheck this, I will not be able to see it anymore. I'm going to click on OK. Now let's just confirm what has been done. So if I exit out of R2, notice that this is R2, not on R1. And I try to log in. Now it asks me for username and a password, CCP and Cisco. So this is because of the AAA that has been enabled. If you remember on R2, we didn't need to enter username and password before we logged into the console. So let's just take a look at the AAA configuration. Show run, I'm just going to say section AAA. So you can see that AAA new model has been enabled. You can see that we have some authorization and authentication policies, which we will talk about in the next video. So let's stop this video here and take a look at what we've learned so far. This brings us to the end of this video, where we have looked at an introduction to AAA. We have described the different parts of AAA, which is authentication, authorization, and accounting or auditing. And then we have enabled AAA on both R1 and R2. If there's anything you take away from this video, it should be that AAA is not something to be joked with. You should always have a backup username and password combination in your local database before you enable AAA. I hope you have found this video informative, and I'd like to thank you for watching. In this video, we'll look at an in-depth study of AAA. We will consider method lists and then focus on authentication. Now let's talk about this command for a moment, AAA new model. Remember that this is the command that we use to enable AAA on our Cisco devices. So once you enable AAA, what does it do? The first thing that you need to know is that it enables all lines to use the local database to ask for a username and a password. So even if you don't have the login local on your lines, it's going to implicitly ask all lines to request for a username and password. So what this means is that if you don't have any username or password in your local database, you will not be able to log in remotely. But the only exception to this is that this is not configured by default for the console. So even though all lines would require the local database, the console is exempt. So if you configure AAA through a remote connection and you didn't have a username and a password, you still have a backup of coming to the device and connecting to the console line, because by default AAA doesn't apply any authentication to the console. But this is different with CCP, as we saw when we configured it on R2. When CCP configures AAA or enables AAA, it takes some precautionary steps. The first is that it enables authentication and authorization. So authentication and authorization on the VTY lines using the local database. And you also notice that it also enables authentication on the console line, also using the local database. Right, so these are the things that you need to be familiar with. So you need to understand these things about AAA and how AAA changes how the router thinks about authentication in general. So we'll move over to R1 and R2 and see what we've configured so far. So let's take a look at where we currently are. On R1, if we do our show run and we look at, well, let's just do the entire show run. We'll do the same on R2, show run. So on R1, you notice that we enabled AAA. That's the command that's all we did. We only enabled AAA using the AAA new model command. And then if we scroll all the way down to our console, we see that we have nothing. Even the login lookout that we had there before, we don't have it anymore. If we go to R2, we see the same thing. Every login that we had is disabled. And we can scroll up and see the AAA. So we have AAA new model, and then we have this command that we're going to talk about in this video shortly. One thing that you need to note is that when you go to your line, so let's go to line console 0, notice you don't have the local command anymore. You don't have plain login, so you have to enable either login authentication or this other control C disable. So when you enable AAA, it changes the way your login command even functions. I'm just going to exit out of here. So let's just do a recap. If we go to R1 and we telnet to 2.2, which is R2, so we need a username to log in. And we need this username to log in even though we don't have the login local command on the VTY lines. So that is because we have enabled AAA. Just going to exit out of this telnet session. Now let's take a look at the configuration commands that we have under AAA. So I'm just going to do AAA with a question mark. So we have accounting, you have attributes. The one that we're interested in this video series is accounting, which enables accounting configuration parameters. You have authentication, and then you have authorization. We have some other group configurations that we're going to see and other server configurations that we're also going to see. So let's talk about method lists for a few minutes. Method lists actually give you a way to control the features. So when I talk about features, I mean the different features of AAA, that's accounting, authentication, and authorization for the different parts of your network or for the different parts of your device. So for example, on the console line, you may want to use your local database for users to connect or for users to authenticate. While on your VTY lines, you want them to use an external AAA server to log in. So that's what method list allows you to do. It gives you the flexibility of controlling how users can connect either for authentication or for authorization or for accounting. Now you notice that method list will be very different. So the method list for authentication will be different from the method list for authorization. They have different options, as we're going to see. In this video, we're going to start off with the one for authentication. Let's go over to R2. Remember that when CCP configured AAA for R2, it created some method list. So this is an example of a method list. AAA authentication, login, default, local. And this is the one for authorization. We're going to focus on authentication in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about authorization. Now let's go back to R1 and see authentication and look at the options under authentication. So notice the different options that we have under AA authentication. We have AR, we have attempts. So attempts, we can set the maximum number of authentication attempts. So this can be good for like brute force attacks. So brute force works by trying to use thousands of passwords in a particular minute. So if you set the maximum number of authentication attempts, then brute force would be kind of limited. You can also set the banner for use when logging in. And then we see that .1x, this is something that we use for 802.1x. If you're in the Cisco security world, you're still going to need this 802.1x, maybe in your CCSP or in your CCIA. Now you notice that we can also set authentication for enable. So it won't use the enable secret or the enable password. It will use what we configured here. So you also have a fail message, and then you have login. Now the one that we are concerned with and the one that would be our focus, because that's what you use for like your console line and your VTY lines. Everybody who tries to log into this device, this is the option that we're concerned with. You can also change the password prompt and you can change the username prompt. So let's focus on login for a while. and look at the options. So you can see that we're building our method list gradually. We started with AAA, now we're on authentication. We're going to go to authorization in the next video, and we'll also look at accounting in another video. Now we are configuring something for the login, and then the next thing it tells us is a name. So it asks us for a name. Either you use the default, so default is a keyword, or use a word. Now let me tell you something about the different types of names that you can have for your method list. If you use the default is going to apply to all lines that do not have a named method list. So for example, if you look at R2, this is default. So the name it's like a keyword, it's a Cisco keyword, default. So default means that on all lines mean your console, your aux port, your VTY lines, all lines that do not have a named method list would be applied with this particular method list. So we can say default is like a general method list that is used for everybody that doesn't have a specific method list. So right now I'll leave it as default, and then let's look at the options. Now these are the different methods that you can configure. So what it says is that what method do I want the lines that have this method list applied? What method do I want them to use to ask users to log in? Do I want them to use the enable password? Do I want to configure a server group that's either TACACS or Radius, as we're going to see later? Do I want them to use Kerberos authentication? Do I want them to use the line password? Do I want to use local username, or to use a case sensitive local username? Or do I just want them to log in without any authentication? And then here I can set the password expiry. So this is where we see the true nature of method lists. These are the methods that you can configure for people to access. In this case, we're configuring authentication methods. So people can either authenticate using the enable password or the group. Group, as we'll see, let's just do that. Group has several options. So you have Radius, or you have TACACS, so you have a server group name, which can be Radius or TACACS. Now, for these methods, you can have up to 4 configured. Now, what I mean by up to 4 configured is, so if I have something like Radius, and then I have local, and then I have group, and no, not group, okay, let me just say group TACACS, and then I have none. Now notice that I can have up to 4 methods configured. The first one is the group Radius, the second one is the local, third one is the group TACACS, and the last one is none. Now it checks it in the order in which I have configured it. If for some reason the group Radius, that's the Radius server, is unavailable, it's going to check the local database. If the local database is unavailable for any reason, it's going to move over to the group TACACS. If the TACACS is unavailable, then it's just going to allow the user to log in. So this enables you to have like flexibility and high availability. So if your Radius servers are unavailable, then you can fall back. So we're configuring like fallback methods. But what you need to understand is that unavailable is not the same thing as fail. So if a user, let's say Bob, has a password of Cisco 1, now an attacker tries to use a brute force for Bob and says Bob's password is Bob1. If this Radius server should reply with a reject, that means like the password is wrong, it will not fall back to local because this has already failed. So unavailable is different from fail, and you need to keep that in mind. So let's do something real now. Let's say we want to have 2 authentication methods. One of them would allow the user to log in without any username and password. So that's using none, as you notice here. So none is like no authentication. And then the second one I want to configure, I want it to use the local database. So let's go AAA authentication. It's for login, so I want to use it for my VTY lines or something. I don't want to use the default, so I'm going to name it. So let me say this one is no auth 10. So no authentication. And then I said I want to use none. So I don't want any authentication on this. I'm just going to use none for this particular one. And then I create the second one, A authentication, login, and I say local. I can call it local DB. And then I say I want to use the local database. Now you need to understand that just creating method list and not applying it to any line has no effect, except it's the default. So if it is the default, it is automatically applied to all lines that do not have anything configured. So let's test this out. On my VTY lines, actually on my VTY, let's say 0, I'm going to use this authentication none. So you notice use the login command, but instead of login local, it has now become login authentication. and then you can specify the method list. Notice that default is also there, but the method list that I want specified is this no auth. So no auth, and then I go to my line vty12, that's every other thing, and I give them the login authentication local database. Cool. So now let's just see how it looks in the running config. Alright, so line 0, I have login authentication no auth, and line vty1 to 4, I have login authentication local db. So if I come to R1 and telnet, R2 and telnet into R1, the first one should not ask me for a username and a password because of the no authentication that we configured. And then the second one, so that's like vty1 to 4, should ask me for like a username and a password from the local database. I will not end this session, but I just want to open another connection. So I'm just going to use the Ctrl+Shift+6X. It takes me back to R2 and I can telnet again. Now notice he asks me for a username, Bob and Cisco 1. Now let's do who to find out everybody that is connected. So you notice that vty0, that's the first connection that we have that we opened on R2, and then we have vty1, which is the Bob user that is connected on vty1. So you notice that this works. So with our method list now, we could say that no authentication on a particular vty line, why we want local authentication on another one. So let's just exit out of this. I would also exit out of the second one. Let's stop here for a while and look at what we've learned already. In this video, we have taken an in-depth study into AAA. We have begun exploring method list, and we started with authentication method list. We configured login authentication method list and applied the method list on our vty lines. We saw how to apply different method lists on different vty lines. In the next video, we'll see how to do everything that we've done using CCP, and we'll configure this on R2. I hope you have found this video informative, and I'd like to thank you for watching. In this video, we will be using the Cisco Configuration Professional tool for AAA configuration, and then we also see an introduction to AAA servers. Our lab setup remains the same. If you remember where we stopped in the last video, we configured some method list on R1. So if I do a show run right now and do a section, say AAA, now you can see that we configured two authentication method lists. One was no authentication and one was for the local database. So we applied the no authentication on one of the vty lines. Let's just look at that. Section line. Right, so we attached the no authentication on the first vty line. So right now, if you try to log in for your first remote session, you're not going to get any authentication prompt. But for the other vty lines, that's 1 to 4, we configured it to use the local database. That's where we stopped, and that's what we did on R1. Now let's go over to R2. If you remember, so I'll just do a show run. If you remember, when we used CCP to enable AAA on R2, CCP took some precautionary steps, and one of them was that it created authentication and authorization method list, and it used the default. Default means that it's applied to all lines that do not have a named method list on them. So let's go all the way to our line config. So you notice that even though there's no login on any of these vty lines or any of the console line, because it's default, it applies to all the lines. So let's go over to CCP and configure some method lists for R2. We are back on the CCP tool. If you notice, I've discovered my devices, R1 and R2. Before we configure R2, let's just take a look at 1.1 and what we have configured on it. If we go to router, we go to AAA, we go to the summary. So first of all, you notice that AA is enabled because we enabled it. Now look here, you'll notice that we have some authentication policies. So we have two login authentication policies. We have none for IP over UDP, and we have none for .1x. Every other thing is 0 because we do not have any authorization policies and accounting policies. Cool, so now let's go back to R2 where we want to configure things. Still under the AAA summary, AA is enabled because we use CCP to enable AAA. Now we do not have any server groups. We're going to talk about AAA server shortly. Now look at the authentication policies. We have one, and then we have authorization policy one. This one, that's the login, and then the exec authorization policy was created by default from CCP. But let's assume that we want to create our own authentication policies. For example, I don't want to have to be logging in with a username and a password on the console. So let's create an authentication method list for the console where it will be none. So it will not be required to enter any username and password. So I'll just come here under authentication policies. So this would give you like a summary of what is configured. Now if I want to configure one, I just go to login. So notice here there's one called default, and then the method is login. And like I said before, there are up to 4 methods that you can configure. So let's just add one. Now notice the name, it says user defined. That's because there's already a default. So let's specify it as, let's say, console, or let's keep our naming convention the same, like the one we used on R1. Now you can specify up to 4 methods. So if I click on add, you can use your control key or your shift key. So you can use shift to select or control key to select, like up to 4. For now, I just want it to be local. For console, it's going to be none. So okay. So notice that there's none there, and I can click on OK. Because we have command preview enabled, we're going to see the command that is going to deliver to the device. So notice it's like what we did exactly: AAA authentication login, no authentication, and then none. So let's just deliver that. One more thing that you can notice here is that it adds this to the running config, not to the startup config. So if you wanted to add it to the startup config, you can select this checkbox. For now, I'm just going to click on OK. Now let's configure another one where we're going to use, say, the group radius servers. I know we don't have any radius servers, but I want to use it for practice. I want to show you something, and then we'll configure a backup of local. So let's just add, let's call it for VTY lines. So let's say VTY lines. I'm going to add the methods group radius and local in that order. So notice it says AAA, this is the name, VTY lines. Then the first method that is going to use is radius. So it's going to try radius server first, and then if radius server is unavailable, it's going to try the local. So let me just deliver it. Okay. So remember that these are not default method lists, so they are not applied automatically. We have to apply them to the lines. So we just come to router access here. Click on, so let's apply the VTY lines. So you notice what is currently applied. It has an authentication policy of default. Let's change that. We'll edit, and then we can change the authentication policy here. So I'm just going to select VTY lines. I'll leave the authorization policy as it is. Okay. So you notice that it's the same commands. It just goes to the VTY line, and then it's going to apply the login authentication under the VTY line. For now, we will not focus on the authorization exec. Let's just deliver the commands. Okay. As you can see, it has changed here. So now that we've applied the ones that we configured for the VTY lines, we need to apply the one that we configured for the console. I went through the CCP tool, and there's no place where you can actually edit the console configuration. So I'm just going to go and add it directly to R2 in the CLI. So what's the name? Let's just check. Right, so the name is Node. So I'm just going to go to my line console 0 login authentication node. Right, so let's just view everything that we have on our line right now. Cool. So our login console has node, so when we try to log in via the console, we will not be asked for any password. Our VTY lines have the VTY lines configured, and the VTY line means group radius and local. Now this is where the fun begins. Let's debug AAA. So we can debug AAA authentication. Now let's go to R1 and try to telnet to R2 2.2.2. Alright, now look at the debug. So it says it picked the method list VTY lines. Now it tells you that AAA bad server error, so it cannot process authentication server type radius. So if I go and use CCP and Cisco, which is one of the usernames that we have in our local database, and click on enter, go back to R2. So you notice what happened. Even though it couldn't find the radius server, it fell back and used the local database, and that's why we're able to connect to R2. So that's the difference between unavailable and fail. So unavailable means, so if you notice here, it says cannot process authentication server type radius. That's because it doesn't know it. So this radius server was unavailable, and that is why it went to the next configured, so like a fallback method. Let's look at it again. Cool. So this is it, the VTY lines. So the first method is group radius. So what it did is it tried to contact the radius server. There's actually no radius server configured. So that just failed completely, and then it fell back to the local. So that's the difference between unavailable and fail. You should keep that in mind. So we'll just stop here for now and look at the different types of AAA servers that we can have on Cisco. Now let's take a look at AAA in general. AAA can be divided into three basic parts: client, the authenticator, and then the authentication server. So let's take an example. If you go to a VIP party and then there's a list of those that should enter. Now, when you arrive as the guest, you are the client. Now, the person at the door, let's say there's a security guard at the door who checks the list. Now, the security guard in this case would be the authenticator. Authenticator in Cisco terms can be routers, can be switches, can be your firewalls or anything like that. Now, your authentication server will be the list that the security guard refers to. So authentication server is the one that has all the profiles. So who should attend this party or who should attend this event? Now that is what the authentication server is going to have. It's going to have things like your authentication profiles, your authorization profiles. You may have things like NAC and other profiles like that. So far, we have used the local database. So in effect, we have merged the authentication server and the authenticator as one. We have been using our Cisco devices and our routers and the local database for that. But generally, there are two basic types of AAA servers. The local AAA servers, which is what we have seen. Now, this is not a Cisco term, it's just for your understanding. So local AAA servers is like your Cisco database, the local database. And then you can have remote database. So those remote databases will be like remote authentication servers. So what is the benefit of having remote authentication servers or remote AAA servers? Imagine if you had 500 devices on your network. You would have to configure local usernames and password for all the users that need to connect. Wouldn't it be better if you had like a centralized AAA server that does everything? That's all your authentication and authorization requests. You could have two for flexibility. But in this case, your remote authentication servers or your remote AAA servers allow for centralized authentication and authorization in an organization. When it comes to remote authentication servers or remote AAA servers, there are two basic protocols that are of interest to us. The first one is Radius. Now, Radius stands for Remote Authentication Dial-in User Service, while the second one is TACACS, or we call it TACACS Plus, which stands for Terminal Access Controller Access Control System Plus. Now, let's look at the differences between AAA and Radius. Now, this is very important, so you should pay attention. The first basic difference is that Radius is an open standard, while TACACS is proprietary. So TACACS is actually proprietary to Cisco. It's actually Cisco's implementation. Now, Radius uses UDP, and then the ports vary. Sometimes you have 1812 and 1813, and then you could also have 1645 and 1646. So it varies depending on who implemented it. While TACACS is TCP, TACACS uses TCP, and it uses a port of 49. So port 49 is what TACACS uses. Another difference that we can have is Radius doesn't support things like NetBIOS, so there's no NetBIOS support, there's no AppleTalk support, while TACACS has multi-protocol support. So TACACS supports things like NetBIOS, supports AppleTalk, and others. Now, another very important security feature is that Radius only encrypts the password field. So just the password portion of the packet is encrypted, while TACACS encrypts everything. So encrypts the full header, the full packet, except the TACACS header, of course. Another very important difference is that Radius combines the authentication and authorization features. So it combines it into one, while TACACS splits everything. So you have authentication, you have authorization, and then you have accounting. So these are the basic differences between Radius and TACACS. Both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. But when you're doing things like command authorization, because Radius actually combines authentication and authorization, TACACS is better for command authorization. This brings us to the end of this video, where we have looked at AAA configuration using the CCP. We configured some method list on R2. We also saw an introduction to AAA servers, and we saw the two types of AAA servers that we can have, local and remote servers. and we looked at the two basic protocols that are used with remote authentication servers, Radius and TACACS Plus, and we saw their differences. I hope you have found this video informative, and I'd like to thank you for watching. In this video, we'll be looking at an in-depth study of the Radius and TACACS Plus protocols. Our lab setup remains the same from the previous video. So if you remember where we stopped, we tested our AAA configuration. So test AAA group. So let's test our Radius, for example. And we can test the username. So we have CCP, Cisco, and then legacy. So where we stopped is that our network devices had connection to the ACS, and then the users were successfully authenticated using the remote AAA server. So now let's look at how Radius works. We'll start with Radius, then we'll go to TACACS. On R2, we already have one of our, so let's check our AAA. So the AAA that is attached to the VTY lines, it checks for Radius first before it goes to local. So let's debug AAA authentication, and then we also debug Radius authentication so we can see the Radius packets. Cool. So I come to R1 now and telnet 2.2.2. So he asks me for a username. So notice what happens. He asks for a username and then he says get user. You pick the VTY lines. So I'm just going to select CCP. So I go back to R2. So after I press enter for the user, it asks me for a password. I'm going to type the password of Cisco. And you can see I have connection to R2. Now let's go back to R2 and see what happened. So basically, what he did is that after he was preparing the packet for the AAA server, so he collected the username, collected the password, and then he sent it to the Radius server of 192.168.12.100. And then you can see that it's sending the Radius packet. It's sending an access request packet, which is one type of Radius packet. So it sends the username. As you can see, the username is in clear text, but the password is encrypted. And then you can see that he received something from the Radius server. He received an access accept. That means my password has been accepted. Now let's do one that is failed. And then all these are some other Radius attributes that I received. Now let's exit out of here and look at one of the users that we don't have connected or that we don't have configured on our AAA. So let's say we don't have Cisco configured, and then Cisco. Now let's look at what it's going to say. So the same thing, it picked the VTY lines, method list, username, password, and then he sent it. So the username here is Cisco. Now notice what happened. It says access reject. So the first one was access accept, right? And the second one was access reject. So as you can see, now we have three different types of Radius packets. The first one is a request. Second one is access accept. Third one is access reject. There's another one which we probably wouldn't see except we're doing things like authorization. The last one is actually the access challenge, and that's if like Radius server is asking for more information or things like that. Cool. So we've seen how it works for Radius. Now let's see how it works for TACACS. So I'll come to R1. As you can see, the username failed, authentication failed. Now on R1, we don't have anything on our VTY lines, or do we? Let's check show run. Let's look at our AA first, and then let's look at our line config line. Okay, so right now on the VTY lines, I'm just going to change everything that we have here. First of all, let's create one that has TACACS. So AAA authentication, login, and then let's call it VTY TACACS. So we want to use group TACACS, and then let's say we can fall back to local. So my VTY line, I'm just going to put it on VTY line 0. So instead of this no auth, I'm going to change it to VTY TACACS. Cool. So that means is going to check the TACACS when somebody tries to telnet on that VTY line. So let's do the same thing that we did on R2. We'll debug AAA authentication, and then now we can debug TACACS instead. Debug TACACS. So we can debug TACACS authentication. Cool. So I'll just come to R2 and try to telnet 1.1.1.1. So he asked me for a username. I'm just going to use CCP. The password is Cisco. So I have connection. Let's go to R1 and see everything that happened. So first of all, you notice that he selected the server that he wants to use, and then there's some read and write operations, and then it says that it should get the user. Once it gets the user, here it tells it to get the password, and then comes back with a pass, meaning, so we have get user, we have get password, and we have pass. Now let's configure something that is wrong. Let's exit out of here, connect again. Let me just say the username is Cisco, password is Cisco. Let's come back to R1. So notice it's the same thing. Oh no, it's trying. I'm just going to exit out of this. It's going to fail. Okay, I'm just going to undebug all so that it doesn't affect anything I'm doing. All right, so it starts with the get user, and then it goes to the get password, and then you can see the fail. So in this case, it failed. In the other case, it passed. So from this logs, we can actually look at the different packet types that TACACS has. So here it has a authentication start. So authentication start. So start is one of the packet types. If we scroll down, we're going to see a response. So it gets a response. So it processes the reply packet. So that's reply. So start, reply, and then it asks for continue. So we have a continue. So when we saw radius, we saw access request, we saw access accept, access reject, and then access challenge. For TACACS, we have start, we have the reply, and we have the continue. One thing that you notice is the difference between radius and TACACS is that TACACS is involved in everything. So when we had the username, it first sends the packets to the AAA server, and then the AAA server will now say continue. But unlike radius waited for it to get the username and the password before actually sending everything to the AAA server. Now let's test something. I'll do a show run and we'll look at our TACACS. So we have TACACS. So you see our TACACS server. I'm going to change that just so that I lose connection to the TACACS server. So I'm going to change the IP version 4. I want to show you the difference between like when it's fail and when the TACACS server is unavailable. So let me just say it's 101 or something like that. I'm just going to check it right now. Section TACACS and make sure that it's gone or that it's changed. Cool. Now debug AAA authentication, and then we debug TACACS authentication. I don't have connection to my ACS since I've changed the password. So let's come to R2 and try to do this again. Telnet to 1.1. Now notice what happens. It's looking for the server. Username, CCP, Cisco. As you can see, it timed out, finding out that the server is not there. So it timed out and then fell back to the local because we configured local, and that's why we're able to get in. Now notice what happened. Even before it showed me the username prompt, it took a while. In case you didn't see it, let me do it again. Telnet to this. As you can see, it took a while before it showed me the username prompt. That's because it's trying to get access to the TACACS server before even showing me the username prompt. So CCP and Cisco. Now exit. Let's restore our connection. Config T. I'm just going to change it back. So back to 100. Now let's do the same test on R2 for radius. So we have, let's just do a show run. Section, no, it should be radius. Cool. So I'm going to change this address also. So radius ACS, I'm just going to change this to say 101 just so it's unavailable. Control Z. Now let's come to R1. No, before we come to R1, let's debug. debug AAA authentication, and debug radius authentication. Cool. So let's come to R1 and try to telnet to 2.2.2. Now notice the difference. It gives me a username prompt. So I'm going to type CCP and it gives password of Cisco. And then this is where the delay starts. Notice on R2 what it's trying to do. It's trying to get access to that server, but it timed out. Still waiting for the radius server. And then after a number of tries, it says that there's no response from the radius server, and then it fails. And then you can notice I'm giving console. So you see the difference between TACACS and radius. TACACS actually is involved in all your username and password. So if you cannot get access to the TACACS server from the beginning, it will even show you the prompt. Unlike radius, radius waits until you enter your username and password before sending all the packets to your ACS server or your remote server. Cool, I just wanted to show you that. Exit, unless on debug all, and change this back. Radius ACS 100. Cool. I'm not sure if I undebug all here. So in this video, you have actually seen the difference between when an AAA server is unavailable and when the username or the password that we typed in is wrong. So when the password that you type in is wrong, it's not going to fall back to another method. It's not going to fall back to the next configured method. The only time it's going to fall back is when the first method or the previous method is unavailable. This brings us to the end of this video, where we have taken a deep look at Radius and TACACS Plus protocols. We have seen how these protocols work, and we have also looked at their packet types. I hope you have found this video informative, and I'd like to thank you for watching. In the previous videos, we have looked at authentication method lists. In this video, we'll be looking at authorization and accounting. That's the other two parts of AAA. And we'll be looking at configuring method list for these other two parts. Up until this point, we have been configuring method lists for authentication. Now let's move on to authorization method list. That is what the person can do once the person is logged into this device, for example. So it's the same method, AAA, but this time we're going to do authorization. Now let's look at the options under it. We have proxy, that's authentication proxy. Now you have command authorization, that's for Excel and shell commands. Then you have config commands, you have configuration, that's for downloading configurations from the AAA server. You have console, this is to enable console authorization, because by default, even when you configure exec mode authorization, console is not affected. So console has its own authorization. The reason is most of the time you don't want to do authorization for your console. Your console should be protected like in your data center. So authorization may not be required, but if you need it, then you can do that. You also have exec, multicast, network, and some other ones. Just the way we focused on login for authentication, we're going to focus on exec. So this is for starting a shell. For example, when you log in via Telnet or when you log in via SSH, it's exec that you're going to use. The two most used authorizations that we have are exec. We also use network. And if you are going to be doing command authorization, of course, you are going to need commands. So let's just configure the exec. Look at the options under it. So it's the same format as the authentication. We can have a word or we could have the default. Let's say we want to put this authorization list on our VTY lines. So let's call it VTY authorization. So I'm just going to use author. Now look at the different options that we have. So you notice that the options that we have, or the methods that we can have for authorization, are different from the ones that we can have for authentication. So we have the group. So we can either have radius or TACACS. We can have if authenticated. So this is going to succeed if the user has already authenticated. You can have none. That means there will be no authorization. It always succeeds. And then you could also use local. So let's use group. Let's configure TACACS, for example, and then we fall back to local. Cool. Now let's take a look at the users that we have configured on our local database. Since we're going to be using the local database as fallback, we want to mirror what we have on the local database on the ACS. So show run section username. I should put a do. So we have Bob, we have Fred, we have Alice, Aaron, and then CCP. Currently on our ACS, we have Bob and CCP, so we can use that as a test. Now that we have created this authorization method list, we need to apply them. So we apply them to our VTY lines. So let's just go to line, VTY, 0, everything. Now, remember that for authentication method list, we did login authentication, but for authorization, you actually use the authorization command. So if you want to do command authorization, you use this one, but we're starting a shell. So we're going to use the exec authorization, exec. And then we can either have the default or the name that we configured, which is VTY author. Cool. So we have this applied. Next step is to go to our ACS and configure authorization policies. I'm now back on my ACS. Now what we could do is, for example, if the admin users login, we want to place them in privilege level of 15, while help desk users, we just want to place them in a privilege level of 1. So help desk users cannot do anything, they can only monitor, while admin users can do everything. So they're given privilege exec mode. Now we do this under policy elements, device administration. So I can create shell profiles for them. Now notice that there's already one shell profile configured already, but I'm just going to create another one. So the name of this one, we'll call it administrators. Administrative, let me just call it administrative shell. And I'll give it, so it will be all access. And then under the common task, I can specify what privilege level, like the default privilege level they'll be placed in. So I can use static and give it a value of 15. Cool. You can also see some custom attributes and you can add those attributes here, but we're not going to bother with that. I'm just going to click on submit. Now let's create another one for the help desk. Call this help desk shell. So we give it monitor only. That will be the description. And then under the privilege level, we'll just give them a privilege level of 1. And click on submit. Cool. So here we have created our shell profiles. Now we need to attach our shell profiles to something. And you do that under the access policies. So this is where you actually add what should happen when you configure like an authorization. So if you notice, there's this default device admin. I'm going to select that and go to authorization. So this is where I create an authorization policy for device administration. Now for device administration, this is the one TACACS uses. And while for network access, network access is the one Radius uses. But we're using TACACS, so I just use device administration. I click on create. I can specify the role. Here I'm just going to put it for administrators. Now under the conditions, notice that you can specify an identity group, you can specify a device group. So what I want to do is, I'm going to say that if any user that is in this particular identity group wants to log into any device that is in this particular device group, then this shell profile should be applied. So what am I going to say? I'm going to click on identity group. Now it's in. And I'm going to select. So any user in the administrative group, right, trying to connect to any device that it's in CCNA security. So CCNA security just contains R1 and R2 right now. So any user that is in the administrators that is trying to connect to any device in the CCNA security should have a particular shell profile attached to it. So let's select that shell profile. The one that we created for administrative is the administrative shell. So I'm going to click on that. OK. And then I'm going to click on OK. So let's create another one for help desk users. Create for help desk. The same thing that I did, identity group. So any user that is in the help desk trying to connect to any device that is in CCNA security device group should be given a shell profile of help desk only. So I'm just going to click on OK and OK. So we have two of our authorization policies configured and they have the corresponding shell profiles applied. So I'm just going to save changes right now. So let's go back to our routers and test. So now that I'm back on R1, let's just debug some AAA authorization. And then we'll also debug TACACS authorization. Cool. So I can go to R2 and try to telnet. So telnet 1.1.1. So he asked me for a username. Let's try Bob first. Bob. And then a password. So Bob's password is Cisco 1. And notice what happened. Show privilege. My current privilege is 1. So if I look on R1, I'll see what happened. So it's picking the authorization VTY author. It's sending some shells. And you'll notice here that it's saying the AV privilege level is actually 1. Authorization successful. Now, let's exit out of this. And telnet again. This time we'll use CCP. Cisco. Show privilege 15. Let's look at it again. As you can see, the same thing, but this time the privilege level is 15. That means it's actually downloading the user profiles from the TACACS server. The last thing that we need to look at under AAA is accounting. So we've looked at authentication and we've also looked at authorization. Now let's take a look at accounting. Config T is the same format, AAA accounting. Now notice the different options that you can have. You can have accounting for auth proxy, you can have accounting for commands, you can have accounting for exec, that's authorization, you can have accounting for network. So let's just say we want to configure accounting for exec, since we just configured authorization. Notice that you can also create a word and you can create a default. I'm just going to use the default to apply to all the lines. Now I can say none, which is no accounting. I can say start and stop, I can say stop only. So start and stop is going to record the start and the stop of the service. So when the service starts and when it stops. And stop only is only going to record just when the service terminates. So let's use start and stop. And then here you can see that it's going to either use the broadcast or I can specify a particular server group. So let's just specify the group. So we can either use radius or server. We can specify a group name. Here I'm just going to use radius. We have both of them configured. So it doesn't really matter. I can specify another group. So I can specify both radius and TACACS. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it as radius. Cool. Since it's default, I don't have to apply it to all the lines. So I'm just going to leave it here and then we'll go over to the ACS. Before then, I'd like to show you what we have on the ACS already. So if you look at this monitoring and reports, we can look at the monitoring and report viewer. I want to show you that some sort of accounting was in place even before we configured accounting method list. So if I come to favorite right now, I can see the different types of reports that I already have. So you have authentication. These are by default, authentication for TACACS and radius. So let's look at the one for radius. Okay, so we have our username and the requesting device. So we have R2 and R2, we have R1 that tried. Let's go back and check the one for TACACS. So authentication for TACACS. We also have we have CCP and Bob, and it was from R1, R2. So we already have some accounting information here of users who try to log in. These are the ones that are done by default. Now let's use our accounting method list that we configured to generate some reports. We configured our accounting method list on R1, so we can generate something from R2. We'll telnet to 1.1.1. Username, let's use CCP. Password, let's use it. Password is Cisco. Let's just do some things. Config T. We'll just look at maybe a show run. And then let's just exit out of R1. Cool. Now we'll go back to our ACS and see if it generated anything. So if I come under this catalog and I look at AAA protocol, so we have different accounting packets here. There's radius accounting, there's radius authentication. There's also TACACS accounting, authentication, and authorization. But the one that we're concerned is with the radius accounting. So let's click that. As you can see, This didn't load properly. Let me just try that again. Videos accounting. Okay, so as you can see, we have our stop and our start. Using the CCP, which is the username that we use to connect, we can actually look at the different details. As you can see, we have different details. We have the time this was logged, and then we have the network device group, the network device name, R1. So we have different details, and this is what accounting does for us. If you scroll down, you can see the other attributes. You have the device IP that logged in. You have the different session keys. And so we have actually seen all the different parts of AAA, beginning with authentication. Now we have done authorization, and finally we have looked at accounting. This brings us to the end of this video, where we have configured method lists for authorization and accounting. We have also seen how to configure authorization profiles on the ACS, and we have also seen how to view accounting information. I hope this video has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for watching.